Here we go. So welcome, Yvonne. We're so glad you're here tonight to present information with us, on Project 2025 and stuff with DEI. So you just take it away and just be yourself and present in your professional way that you always present. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and thank you for allowing me to share Project 2025 and Freedom Writers Collaborative version of what we learned. By way of introduction, Freedom Writers Collaborative is a multi-state indivisible chapter. We build ready-made, research-validated social media toolkits to educate voters and raise awareness about issues that affect their lives, especially to reach digital natives, the 18 to 24-year-old group that told Pew Research that they get 100% of their political news online and from social media. So my role on the team is writing copy to accompany the social media content that we build. So in the summer of 2023, we Freedom Writers began discussing Project 2025 and decided to build a social media toolkit on the subject. Well, I was given the horrifying task of reading the Heritage Foundation's 920-page manifesto, to which 110 right-wing organizations contributed, so that I could capture messaging to accompany the social media content that we create. But before I share the details, I want to share a video that we made that accompanies the subject toolkit, so that you can be warned. It's entitled "You Have Been Warned," and it's really disturbing. So Jeff, I'll let you go ahead and tee that up. I don't think the link is in that chart.
Warning of the danger of a Trump presidency. The former members of his administration had created a 900-page document.
It's not showing.
Plans called Project 2025. Again and again, we warned Project 2025 would remove protections for workers and vulnerable Americans to transform the federal government into a tool for billionaires and Christian nationalists to destroy our country.
I think you need to stop share.
Perfect plan for a fascist takeover. Of course, Trump denied it, but the evidence was clear. Many former members of his previous administration were among the authors and will hold high positions of power in his new regime.
Jeff, we can only hear it. We can't.
Excuse me? Yvonne, were you saying something?
Yeah, the video is can you hear me, Jeff?
Yes, I can hear you.
It's going really fast and it's a little bit muddled sounding. It's not clear.
I can start it over. Let me try.
Okay.
I'm not sure what's going on.
The slideshow is showing, but the video is not showing. We can only hear it. We can't see
All right,
it.
let me do a stop share and then start over again.
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
It's okay. It's only Zoom land.
For more than a year, journalists, activists, and politicians have been warning of the danger of a Trump presidency, that former members of his administration had created a 900-page document with all of their totalitarian plans called Project 2025. Again and again, we warned Project 2025 would remove protections for workers and vulnerable Americans to transform the federal government into a tool for billionaires and Christian nationalists to destroy our country. The perfect plan for a fascist takeover. Of course, Trump denied it, but the evidence was clear. Many former members of his previous administration were among the authors and will hold high positions of power in his new regime. Project 2025 represents a fundamental change to the American way of life. It gives vast and deadly powers to the office of the president and strips away the rights and protections from our citizens. Look it up, tell people about it, and let them know. You have been warned.
We'll put it in the chat later so that you can go and take a look at it independently.
Did it not show up?
It did. It did. It was just kind of choppy.
All right, sorry. It may be my connection.
No worries. Thanks. We can go on. Okay. Well, let me start with the 4 pillars that make up Project 2025. I often describe this as a compilation of Margaret Atwood's Handmaid's Tale, George Orwell's 1984, and Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451, all banned books, by the way, completely with a slew of Jim Crow and Jane Crow era, all coming together in this horrible, dangerous plan to end democracy as we know it. And even though Trump spent his entire campaign feverishly moonwalking away from Project 2025, take my word for it, this is Trump's plan. His name is mentioned 312 times in this document. The Heritage Foundation wasn't ready in 2017 because they were just as surprised as we were that he got elected, but they're ready now, and actually they're already beginning to implement some of these things. So let me talk. Policy agenda mandate for leadership, otherwise known as the conservative promise. Now think of this one as the policy Bible, and that this is their words, not mine. The entire book's sole purpose is to reshape federal policy to shift from societal and constitutional norms that we've been living under for 249 years and will result in the termination of many, many more of our freedoms. The second pillar is their personnel database, which resumes from conservative scholars, academics, and policy experts, conservative ones, of course, are being compiled. You can think of this particular pillar as the conservatives only LinkedIn database, where authors of this policy set a goal to have at least 200,000 recruits already in the database, and they've exceeded that already. This is a way to have a readily available pool of ideologically aligned people to pull from when it comes to filling all the positions they plan to create, and as they fire the civil servants who hold those jobs today. Again, these are their words, not mine. I will explain more about that a little later. The third pillar is the Presidential Administrative Academy. It's an online educational training system built to indoctrinate, and that's the word they use, potential U.S. government employees under the rule of the next conservative president, which in this case turns out to be their useful fool, Donald Trump. Just a few weeks before Biden dropped out, ProPublica obtained more than 14 hours of never before published videos from Project 2025's Presidential Administration Academy. And despite Trump's efforts to disavow his knowledge of this thing, 28 of the 34 speakers in those videos had previously worked in his administration. Pillar number 4 outlines the transition plan in a 180-day playbook that's driven by the policy initiative roadmap itself. It's their preamble, and it's been around for a long time, way back to Newt Gingrich and the Clinton era. And as I understand it, this is the 12th iteration of their plan. So folks, these 4 pillars make up Project 2025. I did a chapter by chapter deep dive into the details of this diabolical plan, is the only thing I could call it, to dismantle the government and our society as a whole. So I'm going to take you through some of those details, especially those that are risk to the communities of color. And then we can discuss actions we can take to resist this avalanche of hate and loss of even more constitutionally protected rights and freedoms that are already coming at us. The resignation of Trump's appointed FBI director from the first term, Christopher Wray, previews what we can pretty much expect for the next 4 years. Next slide, please. As I said, this is an opportunity for acolytes to come in and become part of our government. So chapter 3 in this book is entitled Centralized Personnel Agencies Managing the Bureaucracy. This part of the mandate will undermine the checks and balances in our government and give Trump and future conservative presidents dictatorial control over federal agencies. Keep that word in mind, dictatorial control. It will concentrate all the power into the executive branch by advocating for expanding presidential powers over all the agencies, including the independent agencies, and making it easier to fire civil servants. In fact, one of the key elements of 2025's administrative goal is to reinstate that executive order that Trump had in his first term, known as Schedule F. This would reclassify thousands of federal employees as at-will workers and give the administration the ability to fire employees who don't agree with or follow the extremist policies suggested by Trump and his minions. So think about this. They want to replace tens of thousands of civil servants with scientific or other expertise with people chosen for their political loyalty and willingness to follow orders without question. Try to imagine how many people of color hold these federal jobs all over the United States and how devastating it would be to many minority families and communities to lose those jobs. The plan also would gut requirements for overtime pay and make it easier for companies to classify workers as independent contractors who have few legal protections as employees do. And it would weaken also the workers' ability to organize and form unions. The project makes it clear the Department of Justice will not be independent from the executive branch. All the power will be held by the president. And keep this in mind. Even if Trump hadn't won, they would have just put Project 2025 away in a file cabinet until the next conservative candidate came along. This section also implies that the agency can be used to take legal retribution against whomever Trump decides to investigate. Kevin Roberts, the president of the Heritage Foundation, and therefore one of the main leaders of Project 2025, has suggested that a second American revolution will occur if a Republican wins the White House. Specifically, he said, and I quote, this is before the election, "We are in the process of a second American revolution, which will remain bloodless if the left allows it to be," end quote. This is targeting us, folks. Next slide. Reference to religion are mentioned 115 times, and here are some of those highlights. Under Christian nationalist order, a healthy society is based solely on the biblical definition of a family: a mother, a father, and children who are conceived only in that marriage. LGBTQ families and those who adopt children, they just won't be recognized as a family. This plan encourages private businesses to follow the Supreme Court ruling that affirmed discrimination against LGBTQ plus people and restrict application of laws that provide protection for them in the workplace against sex and gender discrimination. Those 110 organizations I referenced a little earlier are behind these cases that are summarily being brought before a willing Federalist Society-owned Supreme Court that seems to have its own connection to Project 2025. They intend to decree that Sunday, the Sabbath day, will be a mandatory day off work, even for private businesses. So you can forget about taking the family out to dinner. There won't be any places open. Pastors and Catholics for Trump, is a real coalition, I looked it up, are mobilizing clergy to spread Christian nationalist lies from their pulpits. And Trump claimed that a president should have absolute immunity for anything he does, including being able to arrest, imprison, and even execute his perceived enemies. On its face, it's absurd. However, the Supreme Court took that case when they didn't have to. And as I suspected, the Supreme Court waited to release their ruling on his absolute immunity for the last day of their term in June, actually July 1st. So when they ruled 6-3 to give Trump what he wanted, they could quickly and quietly leave for their summer break, having made Trump's delay until after the election wish come true. Such cowards. Next slide, please. Under reproductive rights, the word abortion is mentioned 199 times. These people actually want to establish what they intend to call the Department of Life, right out of Margaret Atwood's 1984 book, The Handmaid's Tale, which is a fictional dystopian view of women losing their rights as citizens and serving as vessels to procreate for rich white men. Another of the project's objectives is to reduce federal government involvement in healthcare. This means that Trump and RFK Jr., his choice for Secretary of Health and Human Services, could take a battle axe to the agencies that run Medicare and Medicaid, as well as affiliated offices that research treatments for insidious diseases, those that approve prescriptions, vaccines, medical devices, and frankly, even personal products like cosmetics. With RFK in charge of Health and Human Services, we could see resurgence of measles, rubella, even polio. And let's not forget that Donald Trump is determined to overturn the Affordable Care Act because it has Obama's name on it. It was Obama's accomplishment, and he hates Obama. This man is willing to kick 45 million Americans off their health coverage to satisfy his racist ego. Project 2025 is going to limit families' options in making government policy to protect fertilized eggs from the moment of conception, threatening access to abortion and birth control in all states, all 50 states, and making it a crime for doctors to provide medical abortion medication. And it would ban health clinics that receive federal Title X funding from distributing condoms, folks, condoms. It won't be long before this man passes a national abortion ban. You should expect women and their doctors to be criminally prosecuted for providing or receiving reproductive services. And as it happened in Georgia and Texas, women, Black women, will die. And as was the law that was passed in Mississippi, they will criminalize the purposeful or accidental destruction of unfertilized frozen embryos in all states. And as disgusting as it sounds, they want to track and monitor women's periods. And if a woman leaves the state to get reproductive health care in one of the states that bans reproductive health care, they want to send law enforcement to chase them down and bring them back to those states for prosecution if they try to seek that health care in blue states. Doesn't that sound ominously like slave catchers who were employed to track down and return escaped slaves to their enslavers? Yeah, sounds that way to me too. And to add insult to injury, they want to eliminate no-fault divorce so that women who are in abusive marriages will not be able to get out of those marriages unless their abusive husband agrees. J.D. Vance, in fact, echoed that exact sentiment during the campaign season. Next slide. Law enforcement, yes. This plan will eliminate the unlawful investigation into the newly elected president or his prior cabinet. Although Trump says he won't, he probably will pardon himself. And in his Man of the Year interview at Time magazine, he promised to pardon the convicted January 6 criminals who desecrated our Capitol on January 6 in 2021 during his, get it, first 9 minutes in office. He even opened up all his rallies with the PA system blaring the J6 prison choir, that's their real name, singing the national anthem. Actually, they were pretty good, but they're insurrectionists, you know? Well, for the rest of us, Project 2025 mandates that the Justice Department will assume control over local law enforcement activities when local governance is deemed insufficient by their federal standards. This includes intervening in how public protests are managed and policed. And with oversights moving away from local to federal, it becomes much more challenging for citizens like us to seek redress or even influence policing decisions that directly affect our communities. Think of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor. Under these plans, those families would not have been able to sue for wrongful death. They promise military and or police crackdowns on lawful protesters, along with jail time or death for protesters without due process. It'll just be whatever he wants to do. And something Trump really wants to do and did do during the Black Lives Matter protests, which is to send the military into blue cities that he deems lawless or high crime, like New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, Seattle, where I am, and so on. Naturally, they desperately want to eliminate diversity, equity, and inclusion, along with affirmative action programs across the government, military, and even private businesses. And I sent Evelyn a document a few weeks ago showing close to 100 companies that have abandoned affirmative action in their hiring processes, promotion processes, processes of giving increased money to those people because of their accomplishments. It's gone. And by the way, DEI is mentioned 39 times and affirmative action, equity, and inclusion 90 times. It is really clear that they are coming after people who look like many of us. Next slide, please. LBTTS. Trump's Project 2025 eliminates federal protections for LGBTQ citizens, including not protecting hate crimes against them. It calls for the Department of Justice to no longer defend the First Amendment rights of these citizens to be themselves, or even eliminates the terms sexual orientation and gender identity from government records and policies. It eliminates terms like sexual orientation, gender identity, gender equality, gender equity, gender awareness, and so on. Abortion, reproductive health, and reproductive rights, among others, out of every federal rule, agency regulation, contract, grant, and every piece of legislation that exists. It's on page 553 in case you want to check it out. It's all there. This means that all these identities, concepts, and topics will be erased in education, healthcare, cultural institutions, and are no longer protected or supported by the government. It halts all research against gender reassignment and defines transgender citizens as pornographers and groomers who should all be prosecuted, imprisoned, and removed from Christian society. And it reverses policies allowing, of course, transgender people to serve in the military or in government. And of course, they'll reinstate the Clinton era don't ask, don't tell policy for military people, gay people in the military. Next slide. Project 2025 proposes to undermine the federal government's ability to protect workers, consumers, communities, and even our environment from corporate wrongdoing. They will end what they see as government interference in energy decisions and stop what they call the so-called war on oil and natural gas, making sure that private companies that threaten our climate are no longer federally regulated. The plan suggested eliminating NOAA and the National Weather Service, replacing those vital organizations with private companies. Their blueprint appears to leave the National Hurricane Center intact, saying, quote, the data it collects should be presented neutrally without adjustments that might be intended to support any one side of the climate debate, end quote. Our seemingly, I'll call them coin-operated, politically motivated activist Supreme Court has provided the avenue for this to happen by overturning the Chevron document. By overturning this 1984 landmark decision in Chevron versus Natural Resources Defense Council, the Supreme Court has expanded the authority of conservative judges to rewrite rules in favor of corporations and special interest groups. This decision marks another power grab, of course, by the MAGA Supreme Court, aiming to increase corporate and special interest influence over Americans' lives. Folks, enjoy that clean air and that clean water while you can. Oh, and don't forget that SCOTUS also ruled, this is too much, that bribes for favors done by lawmakers to get things approved for developers are okay as long as the gratuity is offered after the favor has been completed. Now, follow my scenario here for a minute. Let's say an independent real estate developer, a growing group of oligarchs in the United States, by the way, latches on to a corporate lawmaker. They want to bulldoze a community so they can build luxury homes or mixed-use high-rises or a shopping center. But imagine that property that they want to take by eminent domain belongs to your family, stripping an opportunity for you to pass on generational wealth to your descendants. I can just envision the letter of gratitude to that public official. Dear public official, thank you for displacing all those people so I could make more money. Here's an envelope with a nice bundle of cash as a thank you for getting that job done. Hope we can do business together again soon. Let's meet for lunch and brainstorm new opportunities. Next slide, please. Oh, Lord. As you might imagine, immigrants will not do well in the authoritarian version of America. Trump promises to implement mass deportations of immigrants, shall we say, of a certain hue, and deport them to countries, many of whom have never lived in those countries before. They plan to revoke immigration benefits that have traditionally been granted to unaccompanied migrant children. You won't be surprised the word alien and alien children was mentioned 37 times. I mean, these people really hate immigrants, even innocent children. And just this weekend, Trump said he plans to subvert the 14th Amendment and revoke birthright citizenship. Maybe Byron Trump should be deported. After all, his mother, Melania, is an immigrant. What do you think? And you won't believe their plans for dreamers. You know, those folks who came over here as children with their immigrant parents, who are now tax-paying adults in their 30s, 40s, maybe 50s, and who have never known another country. The plans for dreamers include blocking financial aid for up to 2/3 of all American college students, if their state permits certain immigrant groups, including dreamers with legal status, to access in-state tuition. And they'll terminate the legal status of those 500,000 dreamers by eliminating staff time for reviewing and processing renewal applications, and these folks could easily get caught up in Trump's mass deportation plan. And remember Stephen Miller, the architect of Trump's deportation plan? He has called for denaturalization, where people who came to this country and spent years going through the naturalization process to become U.S. citizens. He wants to strip them of that citizenship and deport them. And what do you want to bet that those naturalized citizens affected will not have come from countries like Norway, Spain, Italy? The other thing they want to do is suspend updates to annual eligible country lists for H-2A and H-2B temporary worker visas, thereby excluding most populations from filling critical gaps in the agricultural, construction, hospitality, and forestry sectors. And imagine how many professionals we're going to lose, especially in the medical and scientific research sectors, if this man goes through with these plans. His project will ban U.S. citizens from qualifying for federal housing subsidies if they live with anyone who is not a U.S. citizen or a permanent legal resident. And they'll force states to share driver's licenses and taxpayer identification information with federal authorities or risk losing critical federal funding. Florida, in fact, already requires hospitals to report any non-residents to Florida state government anytime somebody comes in for medical care, but they can't prove their immigration status. Those undocumented workers were not stupid. On the very day that Governor Ron DeSantis, has signed this into law, many of those immigrants, and I saw it on TV, they dropped their construction equipment, their tools left on the ground. They left fruits and vegetables to rot on the ground, and they moved themselves and their families to friendlier states. It's cruelty against people of color just kind of seems to be the point. Next slide, please. And speaking of cruelty, this brings us to education. And while the document contains dozens of controversial proposals, arguably the biggest one is to shut down the Department of Education, an institution that was created in 1867, not long after the end of the Civil War. The theory, according to this blueprint, is to eliminate red tape so that families who will be free to choose from a diverse set of school options and learning environments, including homeschooling. The plan wiping out the Department of Education also includes the Department of Civil Rights. It's a sub-agency that enforces civil rights laws and investigates schools accused of engaging in discrimination, which has handled more than 19,000 complaints over the last decade and roughly 1,000 cases just in 2022 and 2023 alone. And by eliminating the Department of Education, they plan to propose sending our tax dollars to support Christian schools while dumbing down what teachers can teach in public schools. And they want to allow groups like Moms for Liberty to determine what your children and your grandchildren can read or learn. And of course, curb the teaching of race and equity and equality in schools. They want to eliminate Head Start programs and cut what they call, quote, wasteful school meal programs, end quote. I'm sorry, I get all this really upsets me. They want to swap out Pell Grants for private loans and then eliminate Biden's student loan forgiveness program permanently. And we already see what they're doing to dismantle the public education system, banning books, threatening teachers, librarians, members of school boards, eliminating slavery from the history of the United States. Or when it is discussed, they want kids to believe that slaves somehow benefited by gaining useful skills. And as we know from our history, enslaved people brought many of those skills with them from their homelands and taught their masters. Next slide, please. Ooh. Project 2025 proposes slashing funding to the Department of Justice, dismantling the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Department of Homeland Security, even the National Weather Service, as I mentioned earlier, to sharply reduce environmental and climate change regulations, again, in favor of fossil fuel production. And as I mentioned earlier, under 2025, a second Trump's term will begin by purging nonpartisan civil service workers like EPA scientists, IRS accountants, and replacing them with unqualified toadies. During his first term, he gave the U.S. Department of Agriculture researchers an ultimatum: lose your job or move yourself and your family to Kansas, and at your own expense. Why did he do that? Well, because agricultural researchers published and funded objective analysis of issues such as climate change, the efficiency of food assistance programs, and tax cuts that mostly benefited the richest farmers. Trump didn't receive that well. Our most vulnerable government victim, I think, in this whole process is the Justice Department, starting, it seems, with the FBI, mentioned 119 times. Trump and his acolytes have been casting shade on the FBI for the past 8 years, but the rhetoric has intensified since the arrest and conviction of those January 6th insurrectionists that Trump calls hostages and whom he promises to pardon again in his first 9 minutes in office. And Kash Patel's, Trump's horrible pick for FBI director, has said, quote, "I'd shut down the FBI Hoover building on day one and reopen it the next day as a museum of the deep state," end quote. This man is crazy. We cannot let his confirmation go through. This is what we're facing, folks. This is our next 4 years or longer. Next slide. From the beginning of his career in politics, Trump has referred to the press as the enemy of the people. Therefore, media outlets who are mean to him will be targets of his second authoritarian regime of terror. Reconstructing government communications means complete destruction of the independent press, which under our democracy has always been known as the fourth estate because of its independent role in keeping government in check and working within the Constitution for the good of our citizens. On the other hand, Project 2025 demands a centralized media strategy. The project aims to centralize and control messaging across government agencies to ensure consistency and alignment with the administration's goals. Each department will be required to appoint a strategic communicator to ensure adherence to a centralized media strategy, each aligned with the same conservative messaging framework. Sounds a lot like Russian state-controlled media, doesn't it? Another of his first day in office threats is to pull the licenses of NBC Network so he can shut down MSNBC because of their criticism of him. And remember, during his first term, he called the president of ABC Network, demanding that they fire comedian Jimmy Kimmel because he made jokes about it. And speaking of ABC, they just settled a defamation lawsuit with Trump that Trump brought against them because George Stephanopoulos said that Trump had been found guilty of rape when in fact he was found guilty of sexual assault. But the network caved and gave that man $15 million. Cowards. And let's not forget, at the end of Trump's disastrous first term, he demanded that the head of the U.S. government agency for global media fire the head of Radio Free Europe, whose mission is to provide accurate and reliable information to audiences in countries where media freedom is limited or restricted and has been since World War II. This next one, combating misinformation, is almost comical, coming from a party that spews misinformation all day, every day on right-wing media channels. And to spite the irony, their disinformation task force, a real thing, will be deployed to identify and counteract misinformation, particularly focused on narratives that seem harmful to conservative agendas. They want to promote only trusted news sources and emphasize supporting those that align with conservative principles, potentially through government-endorsed or government partnerships with private media agencies like Fox or Sinclair. And under legal and legislative action, they want to change the libel laws to make it easier for public figures, including politicians, to sue media outlets for defamation. And they're proposing reforms to Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act to hold social media platforms more accountable for content moderation practices that are perceived to be biased against conservative voices. And finally, they're considering the expansion of government-sponsored media outlets to disseminate official information directly to the public. In 2022, Russian President Vladimir Putin signed into law measures that criminalize reporting that contradicts the government's version of events. Can you imagine having outlets like Fox News, Breitbart, OEN as our only trusted news sources? It's disturbing. Next slide. Remember back in 2016 when Hillary Clinton labeled the people around Trump his basket of deplorables? Well, before the election, I tried to envision the deplorables who might fill his cabinet, but I could never have envisioned that he would propose the worst of the worst, but he has done that. We can only hope that the Senate does its job, and we have to press our Senate to do its job and reject some or frankly all of these candidates. Every one of these people will ask, "How high, sir?" when their authoritarian leader Donald Trump tells them to jump. Next slide, please. The road to authoritarianism starts with the election of Donald Trump, but it sure doesn't end there. And it begins the systematic destruction of the administrative state, which has already begun. And soon we'll see the dismantling of more rights that Americans have always taken for granted. Birth control, gone. IVF, gone. Same-sex marriage, gone. Safe water and air, gone. Social Security and Medicare, gone. Safety from gun violence, gone, and on and on and on. This summary I've shared is 920 pages of the many ways that Trump's Project 2025 threatens our future and our freedoms. We have to alert all citizens to these dangers and organize in our communities to protect ourselves and vulnerable members of our communities when all of these atrocities are unleashed on us all at one time, because chaos seems to be where Donald Trump feels most comfortable. But we need to organize within our organizations, understand that this stuff is happening, and then fight back. Authoritarians typically order the arrest and sometimes the execution of political opponents and perceived threats, including military officers loyal to former leaders like President Biden, for example. Think of, Joseph Stalin, Saddam Hussein, Cuba's Fidel Castro, Vladimir Putin, who seems to have a problem with all his rivals falling out of windows or, dying in airplane crashes. But tyrants like this guy put their potential rivals in their place, not to seize power, but to hold on to it. And now that Trump has won, I personally believe he will never leave office.